This is the Atoms landing page at atoms.jamesclear.com. And this is a landing page for an app, right? James Clear is a habit tracking expert, or habit changing expert. He's released this app, and so this is a sort of sub page on his website just to promote this app. And so there are some things here that I really like, and some things here that set it apart from a sort of a standard website. The first thing is that this header is really the only thing that is up here. You'd normally expect some kind of main navigation, but because this is all focused on the app itself, they can really simplify this and be a bit more expressive. You can see here they've replaced the O in the Atoms logo with this sort of shape, this motif they've gone with throughout the website, so look out for that. But I quite like that they're already setting up this motif in the logo, and you'll see it throughout. So that's a very nice way to establish that. If this Atoms logo was in the top left and was very small because they had to make space for a larger primary navigation with different pages you could go to, they might not be able to establish this as well because it would be much smaller. I assume also, but it's harder to see, which hopefully proves my point a little, I assume also that this full stop after the Atoms is also a one of these as well. And so they've already established it twice, essentially, the same sort of shape, the same sort of motif in the logo. And they were able to do that, is my point, because they could make this logo bigger because they didn't have to use the space for a main navigation. So that's one of the benefits of a landing page or a website where you get there and it's for a very specific purpose. You can use the space more creatively. You've got a more sort of standard hero section down here with the calls to action. On the right, I really like this composition. So first of all, they're showing how the app looks. They're making it clear that it's an app for your phone. They're showing it in this iPhone frame. But any mobile app on a sort of tall, narrow screen is going to not take up the same amount of space as your standard sort of 4x3 illustration. One way they've got around that here, which I think is quite clever, is that they've spilled these let's call them atom blocks or atom dots, I'm not sure, but this motif shape. They've had some of these inside the screen, but they've carried them on outside the screen, spilled them out. And so that means that this illustration as a whole takes up more space. You can see it takes up this sort of wedge shape on the page, even though the part you're supposed to focus on is just this tall, narrow phone screen. One thing I quite like about this wedge shape as well is that it matches the shape of the text on the left here of the hero section quite well. And so if you look at this text, the right-hand edge, if you will, of the main title is further out, and then the right-hand edge of the subtitle or the description is further in, and then the buttons are even further in than that. So you've already got this sort of diagonal right-hand edge, and that's matched by the diagonal left-hand edge of these blocks. And the blocks on the right-hand side, these actually animate into place when you load the website. And the blocks on the right-hand side are stopped by essentially an invisible line. I wouldn't be surprised, although I haven't scrolled down to check, if this is essentially the right-hand margin for the content on the page. And so it's also nice that they've used these to set up, to establish that implicit margin line for the content to come. So this is a very nice way of making it all feel balanced, even though you've got this tall, narrow illustration. But I also want to point out on a subtler detail, the line of this container we're about to scroll down to continues as the line at the top of the sort of navigation app, tab bar in the app, which is a really nice example of attention to detail where someone's made sure that these line up. That's maybe easy to miss, but when you do notice it, it feels really good because this feels very satisfying visually. Okay, so if I scroll down, they've given this section a really big, wide container, especially if, as I suspect, this is the right-hand edge of the content. Normally, they've given this much wider space, right? They're making a very bold point, a very important point, based on the visual language. They've also made it very high contrast, and they've jumped in here with these very large numbers, and these very large numbers are yellow, and yellow against a black background. This might be their color palette regardless, but yellow against a black background has a really high contrast. We see it in things like bees, right? It's a very striking color combination, makes us take notice. So They've kept the content simple. It's just number and then text and then number and then text, but they've given it a lot of space. And so if you give something a lot of space like this and really make it big, then suddenly it becomes more visually interesting, right? You're taken in by how bold they've made this because it's out of the ordinary. Plus the black and yellow color combination really draws your eye. And they've had it spill off the page, so it's almost impossible not to want to continue to read this, right? Because well, first of all, they've made it so obvious. So they're basically following their own guidelines here. They're making this obvious. They're making it attractive. I wouldn't be surprised if this third one, I haven't clicked to see it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if this third one also applies to the visual style they've applied here. So this is a very good example of they've taken the message and they've tried to link the visual style to that message so that it reinforces what they're saying. So if I click through here, make it easy. I would argue that they have made this very easy to understand and make it satisfying. And I can only speak as myself from a design perspective, but this interaction has been very satisfying just to go through that journey with the website. I also really like this pencil outline. They've got the 1, 2, 3, and they're all the same size, right? This one comes first if you're reading left to right, but they're all the same size, 1, 2, 3, and so they have roughly the same emphasis apart from that order. So they've reinforced the one you should be looking at because they've put a pencil line around it, and I like that as you scroll through, the next one comes through and just slides into where that pencil line is. Now that's not particularly realistic. You know, if you're assuming this is a blackboard, there's no way to make this happen in real life. But that's one of the benefits of technology, is that you can take those concepts, those visual styles, and essentially upgrade them with technology where you can click the next and it slides through and the number slides right into place and is now the focus point, the highlighted point. So here again, they've got this sort of block motif, these atoms. They've done it a bit differently here. They've got the shape we expect from up here. Oh, you can see them animating into position now and how they stop on this line. But yeah, we've got this shape here that was established, and that is used now as this sort of background color fill. And actually they've taken the same shape and put it in this sort of chalk outline as foreground, so that they've doubled up on the motif, and that's quite a nice way of adding visual interest. If they had just had the one shape in the background or just these shapes in the foreground, it might feel a bit empty. This is using the same shape twice to make it feel richer, have more depth. But you can notice also that this chalk outline is an echo of this chalk outline. I don't think we've had, no, so there hasn't been a chalk outline until this point, but they've introduced it here where it makes sense, sort of white chalk on a black background, maybe it's a blackboard. And then they're reusing it here, so they've already established this style, there's no need to waste it later on the website and only just have a one-off, right? Everything's going to feel more coherent if you establish this style and then find more creative ways to use it. So they've reintroduced it here. It's no longer white on a black background. Maybe now it's charcoal, maybe it's sort of a thick marker or something. But they've used the same visual style in a different way, and that means they're just establishing a few things up front and then using them to good effect later, which is sort of the essence of elegance, right? Doing a lot with a little. So that's quite nice. As I scroll down, this background color fill shape thing scrolls with me. I assume it'll be used to, again, highlight the things that I should be focusing on, which, if it's true, is sort of a reverse of this. Right here, the chalk was used to highlight the thing. I was scrolling it along. Now the chalk is staying where it is, right, and the background is moving along. And they keep the chalk in the foreground for each section. So that's quite a nice way of giving depth and color to the illustrations, but maintaining this motif throughout in quite a clever way. They could have just had this shape, right, in each of these sections static. So each section has its own background shape. But by keeping this in the background and it scrolls with you, it adds that sense of continuity where you're following this thing, this atom, let's call it, through a journey of the website, and it's echoing sort of your journey through the website. So that's, again, very nice. You can see that not all of these illustrations necessarily fit perfectly within, right? They're not designed to, they spill out a bit, but all of them are drawn with this background in mind. They don't spill out too much, or they spill out in quite sort of symmetrical and nice ways. So here you've got the hands both coming out at the same sort of angle, and the center of the hands are centered with the center of the atom, okay? And here, I mean, this is more, this is not as symmetrical, let's say, but they have still, I'm sure, designed it with this in mind, where the point at which it crosses is sort of a nice harmonious point, and the ways they stick out, these angles, they're probably all considered quite carefully, and I wouldn't be surprised if they redrew them. And I thought of that because this is the first time that something's been completely within the atom, and it fits the shape really well. It's clear that they've chosen this combination and probably drawn this alarm clock with the legs and the bells just so it would fit nicely within this shape. And again with the heart. Okay, so here they've taken a similar concept to what they've been showing us throughout, right? But instead of making it move, they are now having it static, apart from the animation. So they're using that atom shape as a background color to give color to the pot. So that's like a nice terracotta color. And then they're using another one behind this flower to give color to the flower, plus the nice animation, to draw you in. Because this is, again, a call to action. So they want to draw your attention to this section. And so, again, this is a great use of this background motif. And one of the benefits of them choosing such a simple shape is that, as they've shown us, they can use it for so many different things, to represent so many different meanings and to help add color and life to so many different shapes. Because all of these shapes are different, but they're all designed with this in mind, and they're all helped by having these background atom shapes. Although one thing I will say is that this is not a perfect circle, and it's definitely not a square, right? So they've chosen an atom shape that, despite being simple, is still characteristic enough, distinctive enough that you're going to notice it as you go through the website and probably tell that they're all the same, even if they're different colors. If these were circles or squares or triangles or something like that, it might not feel like it has enough character, because we all know circles and squares and triangles, they're such standard shapes. This is this sort of squircle shape, I think some people call it, where it's almost a square, almost a circle, halfway in between. And so this is a way of essentially branding the shape they're using to add this richness, to add this variety. Okay, so as I scroll down to this this section, it's echoing the black container above, which is, it's just the second time we've seen this. And it's also echoing this. So here you've got these white atoms in the background of the app. They're also spilling outside. And then you've got this black container. And so they're essentially echoing that combination of app screenshot and black container. But here they've still got the atoms spilling outside, but they're not in the background of the app anymore. And they've taken on this silhouette feel. So they're adding visual variety to the container itself, but they're not trying necessarily to distract you from the app, because this is about focusing on what the app can do. They're showing you more of the interface. And so I think that's maybe why they've gone for this silhouette approach and no animation, right? It's static. And I think that's so that you can focus on what they want you to focus on, rather than repeating this sort of spilling atoms animation. I think this is a reversal of what we saw above with the, so here the atom itself is moving and all the content is scrolling, or the atom itself is staying where it is and all the content is scrolling. And here the content is moving and the sort of structure of the page is staying where it is. So I think that's essentially a reversal, but it uses the same sorts of concepts, right? So it's a nice way of saying, okay, we've set up this concept of things scroll with you or things don't scroll with you, and how can we use that in a different way so that, the technology is the same, but the feel is different. And so here they're using it to take you through screens of the app, which is quite a nice way of potentially showing you different things without having to come up with all these different layouts to represent these. So you can see here the background color of these containers is the same as the color used for these atoms. I think that's the only place it's been used so far, apart from very small things like these dots. So they're using it for these atoms, and now they're reusing it for these containers. So different shape, but they're reusing a color to make everything feel more coherent. And also when you hover over it, they're reusing the black they used for the containers above. One thing I find interesting about this, and maybe a faint criticism, is that they've set up this sort of half circle, half square motif throughout. And apart from here, you've got this big standard container. They are using that standard container shape here as well, and then they're using it for these. But because these containers are smaller, it would have been interesting to see how they approached it if they'd used the square circle atom shape for each of these containers. If there was a stack of those, it's hard to show what I mean by moving the mouse because it's triggering all these hover states. But if there was a horizontal stack of those square circle atom shapes used for each of these containers, so you'd have one for this make your habits fun, one for aim to be great. That might be quite interesting. I suspect it was relatively hard to do that in HTML and CSS, and also it gives you less space because they're sort of square shaped, even if they're not perfectly square. It gives you less space to work with, for example, this text that you get when you hover over it. It would be much harder to fit this in to this square shape and not have each of the containers overlap. But I do wonder if they tried to bring that motif through, make it more coherent, and use those square circle shapes for these containers, and then realize later that it wouldn't work, or if they just went sort of practical straight away, because this is definitely more practical, but feels like it belongs less. Even though these containers are used up here, they're used in such a structural, page-wide way that I don't focus on them as much. Whereas here with smaller containers, I'm more focused on their shape. They become more foreground elements, whereas these are more background elements to contain foreground elements, if that makes sense. I assume that the color that they've been using throughout, this sort of yellow-grey color, is meant to echo the background of the Atomic Habits book, because you can see it here and it's almost the same color. And if so, I quite like that because they the book already existed before the website, and so they almost had not an accent color, but a color that would help make things slightly more colorful, than black and white, ready to go. And I assume it's the same with the sort of yellow, orange, gold color here, and they've used this yellow gold color throughout and here in the app. It's quite nice to, if you have a book that you're basing this all on, take those colors from that book and use them for the website, because then you're getting that coherence across the brand, essentially. It's not just within the website, it's also, if you go and look at James Clear's other stuff, you might realize that it feels the same. And so that feels like they've put the care in, that they're all going to work well together. I find this quite interesting as a button. I think I partly expected this whole container to be a button, because when I see this sort of image or icon on a container, I usually expect the container itself to be a button. I'm less used to seeing just an arrow be a button that you can interact with and the rest of it not be. So that's interesting. I wonder if they suffer any from people not realizing that you click this to go somewhere, because it doesn't make itself explicit, right? It's a very implicit sort of button suggestion that you click this and it's going to do something, it's going to go somewhere. Oh, actually, now that I click it, because I was just curious, I should probably try it. Now that I click it, I realize it's to move on the carousel. So again, I think in that case it was because the length of the arrow suggested button to me, when those buttons for navigation, for example, or action are usually longer than they are tall, or wider than they are tall. And I expect those carousel sort of navigation, carousel forwarding arrows to move back and forth between the slides to be essentially square shaped. So this is kind of playing with my expectations, and I wouldn't be surprised if people don't know what this does at first, or aren't willing to try it in case it takes them somewhere else. Oh, so that's quite nice. This you probably saw it when I scrolled down at first, this animation. So this atom fell in and this atom bounced off it and fell down, which reminds me a bit of the Pixar logo, with the lamp stamping on the, I think it's the eye. It's this very playful way to present your logo. Interesting here that they've got a line here that hits the image of the phone that echoes this. It's not in the same place, and it's not giving the same effect because you don't have the line at the top of the tab bar on the call to action below. But they've still essentially tried to echo that, which is quite nice and quite subtle. I suspect most people won't appreciate that's an echo of the pattern above. Also, the final animation on this website is one I really like, so I'm going to scroll up and then scroll down again. Hopefully you can see it. No. If I scroll up really far and then back down, hopefully it reanimates. Yeah, So I absolutely love this because, okay, they've got the Atoms logo, they've got the O, they've replaced that atom shape with, I mean, it's the same shape, but they've added some details to make it an apple now, right? So it's red, it's got the stalk, the stem, but it's fallen down and joined the Atoms logo. The reason I love this is because suddenly it's making a reference they haven't made before, which is to, I assume, Newton, right? So Newton, the story goes, sitting under a tree, an apple hits his head, and he comes up with the theory of gravity. And I love the fact that they've made a reference to something like that, a very clever person, a person who clearly had their life together when it came to scientific theory. They're making a subtle reference to that, but also people like apples, right? So even if you're not immediately reminded of Newton like I was, the apple falling is it's quite a nice image regardless. I suppose it also makes reference, it might make reference to the apple never falls far from the tree. That's another apple-related saying, but that's maybe a bit of a stretch. But I really like this as a way to take the expectation they've already set with the animation of the Atoms logo and add a bit of flavour to it, regardless of what your associations are. This is just more fun, right? And so they've used this footer space where there's no more things to be distracted from. They've used that footer space to add more personality and show how much they care about this app, because they didn't need to make this an apple. They could have just repeated, this animation where it falls in and it's just a standard sort of black atom. But they did this because it's fun and because maybe it has associations. Maybe those back up what the company does. But they're really expressing themselves, which is always a good thing to see.